Some are concurrent, right? They're in different parts of Israel and dealing with different issues. And we know the pattern is Israel forsakes God. God allows somebody to oppress them. They cry out for God for deliverance. God will raise up a judge. The judge will deliver them from that bondage or that oppression. And then they turn back from God. That's the pattern that repeats itself really through all mankind. Not just the book of Judges, but all mankind, even today. Okay, so last week we were in Judges chapter 7. We were studying a judge by the name of Gideon. Gideon is getting ready to launch a battle. We ended with the battle last week. Somebody summarize what happens.
The other team has way more people.
Yep, that's right. Lots and lots.
Gideon only has 300.
Why only 300? Only 300 people showed up?
No. God only wanted him to have 300 so he could show his power.
Good. They showed up with a lot more. God said too many. He winnowed them out. First he said all the scaredy cats go home. 2/3 of the army left. About 10,000 are left. God says still too many. Have them go drink. And then observing them drink, he says one that laps like a dog, they can go home. The ones that drink with cupped hands, they can stay. There's 300 people left. How does Gideon then deploy them into battle?
Takes 100, like 3 groups of 100.
Okay.
Surrounds them at night.
Okay.
He has a pitcher, a torch, and a trumpet.
Good. Very good. Ann remembers everything from last week. Yeah, that's impressive. What was the purpose of the pitcher? Hide the light. That's right. So that they could get close enough to the enemy before revealing the light. And then it would be all of a sudden there are 300 torches and 300 trumpets going off, which would give them the impression that there is more than 300 out there, right? What's the response from the enemy? They run, right? In sheer terror, they start taking off. And at that point, we had ended with 2 of the kings, the Midianite kings, being killed, Oreb and Zeb. And that's where the story ended in chapter 7. Has the enemy been defeated, though? Well, he's been defeated in the sense that he's been driven from the battlefield, but they could still regroup and come back, and so they're not dealt with yet. There's still an army that needs to be dealt with. So when we get to chapter 8, what we're going to see is Gideon and his army are now pursuing what's left of that army, and there are still other kings in this army that they're pursuing. So that's where we get to chapter 8. So chapter 8, starting in verse number 1, we have this interesting exchange between Gideon and the children of Ephraim. Who is Ephraim? That's right, one of Joseph's sons, one of the 12 numbered tribes of Israel. They were given a possession in the land. So the people, the descendants from Joseph's son Ephraim, say to Gideon in chapter 1, what's the deal? You had all this fun and you left us out. They're a little upset about this, and we're going to see this exchange. So we're going to go to, somebody read verses 1 through 3.
God has delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison with you? Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that.
Okay, what happens here? Ephraim finds Gideon, they find out about the battle, and they're like, hey, why didn't you include us in all the fun? They're a little upset, and Gideon's response is what? In verse number 2. It's telling in what he says in verse number 2 what really is bothering Ephraim. Verse number 2, what does Gideon say to them? Well, that's what the Ephraim might say to Gideon, but what's his response in verse number 2? How does what I've done compare to what you guys have done? Aren't your vineyards way better than my vineyards? meaning your successes are greater than my family's successes. So what are you upset about? You're Ephraim. I'm just from this little family, the Abiezrites, or Beziers. And so he says, look, God gave me the hand of the Midian kings Oreb and Zeb, and what I've done in comparison with you, he said, and then their anger subsided. So he's basically saying, look, all I did is I took care of these two kings. It's a minor thing. You could help me now. Let's go deal with the rest of these guys. Now, could this have turned into a very different story? Yeah, we could have had some infighting, and then the enemy wouldn't have been destroyed. They would have been fighting, the children of Israel been fighting against themselves, which happens in history. There are times when the tribes of Israel war against each other. So this was a tense moment. Now, we know that they're fleeing from pretty much where the area of the tribe of Manasseh is. And if you remember in chapter 7, Gideon sends word to all the other tribes and says, hey, go block the crossing points so they can't get out. We want to bottle them up so we can slaughter them and kill them. We don't want them to escape. So what is the body of water that runs right through the middle of this area? The Jordan River, right. So he's trying to make sure they don't get across the Jordan. If they get across the Jordan, they might be able to get away. And if they get away, it means they're going to have to fight them on another day, at a day and time of their choosing, at a time when it's advantageous for them, not for the Israelites. So they're trying to pursue them, and they're trying to deal with them. Now, interesting thing we're going to see here is the discourse between Gideon and two cities that are on the course. And I apologize because I actually put a map in here on the left, and it's not coming through this morning. It didn't update. But it would show you the path they took. So he's pursuing them. He's going to try and cut them off. They're in this Jordan River Valley. And he's got to get the rest of the army. And we're going to find this run-in with two cities that it's an interesting story, I think. So we're going to go to verse number 4. And somebody read 4 through 10.
already in your hand that we should give bread to your army? So Gideon said, well then, when the Lord has given Zebulun and Zebulun into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars.
Okay, pause right there. So we're in Succoth. The men are exhausted. They've just fought a battle, and they've been pursuing through the night into the next day. They're hungry, they're thirsty, and they're tired. They come to a city. Gideon says to Succoth, what? Hey, come on. Feed, give us some water, give us some food. We're exhausted. Succoth's response is what? Yeah, we're not picking sides until we're sure who the victor is. If we give you bread and you lose, we're going to pay for it. So you go take care of business, then you can come back. We'll give you everything you want. Is that the response that Gideon wants? His response to them is what? Yeah, I'm coming back. We're going to deal a little justice. We're going to get I can't say it now. The thorns and the briars, and we're going to whip you with them. How many people ever run through a thorn or briar bush? Does that hurt? It kind of stings afterwards too, doesn't it? That's going to be bad. Now, we're going to find out Gideon is a man of his word. So remember this statement. So they go from this city to the next city. So Mike.
And from there he went up to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. And he said to the men of Penuel, when I come again in peace, I will break down this tower.
Okay, so same thing happens in the next town. What is Gideon's response? I'm coming back. Now, interesting enough, different response though. In one city, I'm going to come back and whip you with thorns and briars. This one, he's going to do what? Okay, why do you think his statement to the people of Penuel is, I'm tearing down your tower? What is a tower in ancient days for? It could be worshiping a god, could be a high place. What else? That's right. It's military fortification, right? You can see people coming. It gives you the height advantage. You can shoot down on the enemy. And people with towers tend to feel a little secure, right? They're, hey, I'm behind the walls. What are you going to do to me? And Gideon says, I'm going to attack what you take as your strength and take that away from you. I'm going to take your tower away. You're also going to find he's going to do something else. I think Penuel gets the worst of this, in my opinion. The other one, they live. These guys, not so much. So, okay. He says in verse number 10, now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with their army, about 15,000 men, all who were left in the army of the people of the east, for there had fallen 120,000 men that drew the sword. Okay, you just defeated 120,000. You have 300 men with you, and how many are left? 15,000. Guess what? You still do the math, you're at a disadvantage. He's still pursuing them because he knows at some point they're going to stop running. They're going to get their courage again. They're going to turn and face him. So he wants them while they're still fearful. All right, so let's see. Somebody read 11 through 14. Okay, so they go and pursue them. There's still 15,000 men. In verse number 11, they attacked the army, for the army felt secure. Zebah and Zalmunna fled. What happens to the army when the two leaders take off running in fear? Yeah, I don't know about you. If I'm a foot soldier who I really don't want to be there, I'm compelled more than likely to be there. This isn't the day of standing armies. This was a farmer who was in his fields, and like King says, you got to go fight a battle, and off you go. And now I'm standing in this line, and I look behind me, and I see the two guys way behind me with 15,000 people between them. They turn tail and run. I think I'm with them. I'm surely behind those guys. They must know something I don't know. Maybe there's an army behind them, something, but the army panics. And when they panic, what happens? The Israelites win, right? They defeat the army of 15,000, again, with 300 people. It's just phenomenal that 300 people could deal with 15,000. So he deals with the army, and then the next thing Gideon does is what? He's getting some intelligence on those two cities. He says, all right, give me a list of everybody I need to know about. And remember, I'm supposed to come back and whip them with thorns and bristles. I need to know who's supposed to get that. So he gets a young man. He says, write down the officials and the elders, and there's 77 men that they account for. Now, I didn't want to pass over verse 13. Verse 13, some translation's going to read something different. I think King James has it different. Verse 13 says, then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from the battle by. Who has King James? What does it say after that? Anybody have King James? Okay, so there is some dispute on the proper translation of this last part of the phrase. And it's because of the words that are used here. Some will tell you that they think this is referring to a place, and some will tell you it's referring to a time of the day. So King James translates it at a time of the day. Gideon's coming back as the sun's coming up. Others will say this is referring to a place. And my research led me to a couple of places. If you look in Joshua 19:41, There's a city called Ir Shemesh, which literally translated is the city of the sun. Some people think that this is referring to the same region. In Judges chapter 1, verses 35, in that particular section, there's a reference to the mountain of Harris. We really don't know. So if you have King James, you're reading that, and you're going, that's not what mine says. There is some dispute on what that should be translated. Should be translated meaning a place, which is the Mount Heres or the city of the sun, because Heres can be translated sun, or is it referring to a time of the day, which is why there's a difference. Okay, so that's verse number 13. He now gets the name of the 75 men, and now we're going to read 15 through 17. 15 through 17.
And he came to the men of Succoth and said, Here are Ziba and Zalmunna, about whom you ridiculed me, saying, Are you the hands of Ziba and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your weary men? And he took the elders of the city, the thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth. Then he tore down the tower of Peniel, killed the men of the city.
All right, what happened? Was Gideon true to his word? Yeah, he was true to his word. He did exactly what he said he was going to do, and then some. In Penuel, he said he was going to tear down their tower. What does he actually do? Yeah, all the men. So the town is going to take a long time before it can boast in its strength again. Okay, now he's got to deal with the two kings he just captured. Remember, he just traipsed across the Jordan Valley and across to the other side. He's now caught them at Karkath. Is that the name of the place? I think that's right. Anyways, he catches them, and now he's got to deal with these two men. So the next part of this passage is Gideon dealing with these two kings. All right, so verse 18 through 21.
He said to Jether, his firstborn, Rise and kill him. But the youth did not draw his sword and reach to pray, because he was still a youth. Then Zeba and Zalmunna said, Rise up yourself and fall on us, for as a man, so is his strength. So Gideon arose and killed Zeba and Zalmunna, and took the crescent ornaments which were over their camels' necks.
Okay, so what do we see here in this section? What's revealed to us? It's important. What do we learn?
I don't know if this is important, but he had a son.
Okay, so Gideon has a family. Good. What else do we learn about this relationship between Gideon and the Midianites? Okay, if you remember, when we started this section, we talked about the history between the Israelites and the Midianites. And there was a time where Moses had destroyed them, right? Had just annihilated them, and they now were getting their revenge. So what we learn here is there's a lot of bad blood between these two peoples. And in this particular case, it's personal for Gideon, because apparently Gideon and his family fought a battle at Tabor. Some people think this references back to the battle with Deborah and Barak. I think it's unclear whether it's referring to this or some other battle, but some battle occurs between Gideon's family and the Midianites, and his family is wiped out. And apparently these two kings must recognize that this was Gideon's family, because when he says, what kind of men were they at this battle, their response was what? They were like you. They were kings like you. They carried themselves with this decorum that would make us think that they were leaders, right? And so Gideon says, those were not just people like me, they were people like me. They were my family, and you slaughtered them because you killed them. Now I have no choice. I would have let you live, but now I can't. I got to exact revenge. But the interesting thing to me about Gideon is what he does next. Gideon says, I need to exact revenge, so who's going to do it? Gideon or somebody else? Now, why? Why in the world would Gideon turn to his eldest son and say, I've made this decree, go carry it out? That's right. You're not worthy to die at my hands. And what's another reason? If you want to perpetuate a family feud, you have to pass the anger and the resentment down to the next generation. So here his son is, who would have been removed from all of this, and he's coming of age. It tells us he's still a young man, and he says, you go do it. Because now his son is going to be carrying on this feud between the Midianites. That's what I believe is happening here. So the son doesn't do it because he's young and not hardcore killer, right? He still has some innocence to him. He's like, I don't want to draw my sword and kill these two men. And the two kings are like, don't let that guy kill us because he's not strong enough to do it. So think about that for a minute. If you're going to chop someone's head off, you got to have some strength to do that. They looked at this kid and said, that's just going to hurt us. That's not going to kill us. You do it. So the son doesn't do it. Gideon rises up. He takes care of business. And when he takes care of business, then what happens? He takes the stuff. Now, this is interesting what's going to happen next. To me, everything up to this point is pretty typical in the stories of the judges. You'd see a lot of this. You know, they oppress the people. A judge rises up. He does some fantastic feat. And then people go back to life. What happens in this next part, I think, is very significant and very different with Gideon. Gideon starts to tip his hand here. After he kills them, he takes the gold ornaments off their camels. Now, why would you take gold off of the camels? There's a couple reasons. I might do it because it's gold, and I could spend gold, and gold buys me a lot of things. Why else do you think he might be taking the gold? There you go. He's going to make something with it. So keep that, because we're going to see what happens next. So now in verse 22, let's read 22 through 28. We're going to find out what Gideon is going to do with his gold. So remember, the two kings looked at Gideon and said, yeah, we fought people like you. They were like you in that they were kings. And Gideon is a leader now. He now defeats 4 kings at his hand. They rout these 4 kings. And now in verse 22, the people say what to him? He says, rule over us, you and your sons and your grandsons. What do we call it when you have a ruler who rules through his descendants? It's hereditary rule. It's definition of a king, right? So his bloodline is going to be the king. This is interesting because if Gideon had been an ambitious man, an arrogant man, we'd probably have a very different response. Gideon says to him, verse 23, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord rules over you. You think, oh, what a great guy. I mean, look at this. He understands his place in God's kingdom. He says, I'm not going to be your king because your king is God. Okay, if the story ended there, we'd have a very different discourse about Gideon, but it doesn't. So somebody read 24 through 28.
Glad to give you to them. And so they spread out a garment, and each man threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings, he asked for, came to 1,700 shekels. That's a lot of money.
That's a lot.
Not counting the ornaments, the pendants and the purple garments were worn by the kings of the Midian, or the chains that were worn on their camel necks. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed over his town, and all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping there and became a snare to Gideon and his family.
Okay, so Gideon says, I won't rule over you because God is your king, but I will make this one request. Everybody give me an earring. And then the Bible parenthetically says, well, the Ishmaelites wore a lot of earrings, so they would have a lot of earrings. How many men did we factor in? Is it 120, 135,000, I think was the number we just read a few verses ago. So if every one of those guys had 2 earrings, it's a lot of earrings. And then it says he had 1,700 shekels of gold. Now, the source I consulted said that would equate to about 43 pounds of gold. 43 pounds of gold. That is a lot of gold. A lot of earrings. And what does Gideon then use those earrings to make? Well, he's going to make it, it ends up becoming an idol, but the Bible uses a specific term. Ephod. Okay, good. Remember that. So when I read this story, the first thing that came to mind were the people then contributed gold that was going to be made into an idol that was a snare to the people. What story comes to mind? That's right. Aaron. Remember Moses goes up on the mountain to get the 10 Commandments that were written by God himself. And while he's up there, they're like, hey, we want a God. And Aaron says, oh, give me some gold. And everybody takes the gold that they took from Egypt. They contribute it to him. And then Aaron makes a golden calf. And when Moses comes down, he's so angry, he breaks the 10 Commandments that God had done, which God's going to say, since you destroyed my work, you can be the one to chisel everything out. And when he asked Aaron, what did you do? He says, I didn't do anything. They kind of threw the gold in the pot, and out jumped a golden calf. Similar stories. Similar stories. What else is significant about this? Not just the semblance of what we saw in Exodus chapter 32, but he makes what? What's the Bible say? He makes a ephod. What is an ephod? Okay, ephod. Ephod, then I will tell you, there is a lot of debate on this word. A lot of debate. So by no means what I'm going to tell you is ironclad, it is the truth, but it is what I've researched, and I think this is telling us. And I think this is why he makes an ephod. The first thing that people say is, we want you to be a hereditary king over us, and his response is, no, I won't be a king. Instead, I'm going to make an ephod. Who else wore an ephod? The high priest. And the ephod was one of the symbols that you were the high priest. What does it mean to be a high priest? That's right. You have a unique relationship with God, unlike everybody else, because only you are permitted to go into the Holy of Holies once a year to make atonement for sin. You are the one that God is going to converse with. If anybody in the camp, it's you. He says, I won't be your king because God is the king, but what I will be, I believe he's saying, is your high priest. So he makes a golden ephod. Now the ephod, it's the Hebrew word used here can be translated a lot of different ways, which is why it's confusing. But if you go back and look in Exodus chapter 25 and verse 7, Exodus 28, 4 through 13, and Exodus 29, 5, you'll find the ephod is part of the garment that the high priest wore. So the ephod was remember the breastplate that had all the different precious stones on it, one representing each of the tribes? The ephod is what that was connected to. So again, there's some debate, but some people say it's literally just a vest that comes to about waist length, and that the high priest would then clip, because there were rings. If you go back and read the description, there's rings put on this linen garment, and that's what you connected the breastplate to. Some say it was more longer, more like a tunic style. Either way, I think the reason why the writer of Judges uses the word ephod, because he's writing to primarily Jewish audience, I think they would have hearkened back to, oh yeah, that's what the priest used to wear. So he makes a golden ephod, which would have been some type of, we might call it a breastplate today, something that he would put on him, that he could potentially put on himself. And it was to signify Not that he was king, but he was serving in a capacity like a high priest. When I read it, that's what I get. Okay, so, and then what happens to the golden ephod? Yeah, people start doing what they shouldn't do. They worship the creation and not the creator. And so it becomes a snare to people. That's ironic because Gideon says, I'm not your king, God is your king. But then he makes a device that makes people start worshiping it, not God. Now the ephod is, this Gideon and his family are going to have some significant problems because of what Gideon does here. We're going to read here just a little bit. This becomes a snare not only to the people, but this becomes a real problem for Gideon and his family. So the ephod was a symbol. It was a symbol saying Gideon was somebody important and special in their relationship with God. He sticks it outside of his house. People begin to worship it. It becomes a stumbling block. Okay, so then the Bible tells us, where are we here? In verse 28, so Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more, and the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. Gideon did his job, didn't he? He delivered them from the Midianites, and now they have this period of peace. When we get to 29, though, we're going to have a very different story develop about Gideon. So what I'm going to ask you to do for next week, because we're getting close on time here, is I want you to read through the end of chapter 8, because I think this is it's an important story. There are a couple of times in the Jewish history where infighting occurs. And this is one of those cases, and it's pretty bad. I mean, this is a pretty bad situation for them. So from Gideon going from God pulling him from obscurity, from a small family that was insignificant, from idolatry, and says, look, you're a mighty man. I'm going to prove it to you. I'm going to use you to do these mighty things. God does mighty things through Gideon. He correctly says, I'm not your king. He could have very easily said, make me your king. He did not. Instead, he makes this golden ephod, which becomes a stumbling block. And when we get to the end of the chapter 8, we're going to find out it becomes a real snare for his family as well. So read through the end of chapter 8 next week. We'll study that. And I think that's our last class for this quarter, if I remember right. So I will send out this material at the end of next week because I'm still writing as we go. And you'll have the latest and greatest. And then sometime in the future, we'll pick this study back up and we'll continue our history of the Jewish kingdom study. Questions, comments? Okay.